before your first memory, before your name learned its sound, before language settled into your mouth, your blood was already carrying a decision. Not a thought, not a belief, a verdict made by time. Why does Ireland, an island shaped by wind, stone, and silence, carry such an overwhelming presence of type O blood? Why does this single letter pulse through so many Irish veins generation after generation, unchanged, unmoved, unforgotten? This is not coincidence. This is not romance. This is biology remembering what history forgot to write down. Tonight, we are not speaking of identity as culture, not as flags, surnames, or songs. We are listening to something older, something quieter. Blood does not lie. It does not exaggerate. It does not mythologize itself. It simply remains. Ireland ranks among the highest populations in the world for type O blood, and blood types do not dominate landscapes without reason. To understand why, we must walk backward, past kings and colonization, past invasion and resistance, past written memory itself, into a time where survival was the only narrator. This is a story not told aloud. This is a whisper carried inside the body. Chapter 1. The first footsteps on a sea-sealed land. When the ice withdrew, it did not rush. It loosened its grip slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the world itself was deciding what it would allow to remain. Great sheets of frozen silence melted back into the sea. Rivers found their mouths again. Land bridges, temporary promises between continents, thinned, cracked, and finally disappeared beneath rising water. And when they were gone, Ireland was no longer merely a place on the map. It became something rare, something final. An island sealed early by the sea. This mattered more than history textbooks admit. The first people who crossed into Ireland after the Ice Age did not arrive as waves. They did not flood the land with endless variation. There were no massive caravans, no imperial migrations, no overwhelming numbers to dilute what came before. They arrived quietly, in small groups, families bound by blood and memory, clans carrying their entire world on their backs, tools, beliefs, fears, strengths, and weaknesses compressed into human form. Each footstep mattered. When a population begins this way, biology behaves differently. Its genetic makeup does not scatter and smooth itself out as it does on large continents. Instead, it tightens, it concentrates. It repeats itself forward through time. This phenomenon has a name, the founder effect. It sounds technical, almost sterile, but its consequences are anything but. The founder effect means that traits carried by the earliest settlers do not merely survive. They set the tone. They become disproportionately loud in the genetic conversation. And what might have been minor elsewhere becomes dominant here. Not because it is superior, not because it was chosen, but because it arrived first and nothing later was large enough to erase it. Ireland did not receive the repeated overwriting that reshaped mainland Europe. No vast armies crossing back and forth, no constant genetic refresh, no steady dilution through scale. Once the sea closed in, what was already present was protected and imprisoned by isolation. Traits echoed forward like voices in a stone corridor. Each generation heard them again, often louder than before. If type O blood was common among those first settlers, then type O would not simply persist quietly in the background. It would multiply, it would dominate. It would become the baseline against which all other blood types were measured. Not through intention, through mathematics and time. On continents, rare traits are often swallowed by numbers. In Ireland, they were preserved, amplified, carried forward like heirlooms passed down without question. The island itself enforced this continuity. Storms made travel dangerous. Distances discouraged constant movement. Communities grew inward rather than outward. Marriage stayed close. Kinship tightened. Bloodlines looped back on themselves, strengthening certain patterns while narrowing others. What entered early became ancestral law, not written in ink, written in cells. And this law did not only govern blood types, it shaped immunity, disease resistance, metabolic tendencies, even subtle aspects of temperament and stress response. Ireland became a biological archive, a place where early human variation was not erased by progress but preserved by water. This is why the island often feels older than its years, why its people carry traits that seem out of step with modern expectations, why certain patterns repeat with uncanny consistency. It is not mysticism, it is isolation doing its quiet work. Long before kings, before myths were named, before saints and invaders and chronicles, the sea had already decided Ireland's fate. It closed the door early, and once it did, history could only work with what was already inside. Every later story, every conquest, famine, survival, and song was built on those first footsteps. Footsteps taken when the land was new, the sea was rising, and the future had not yet learned how permanent beginnings can be. Chapter 2. Isolation as a biological vault. Ireland's greatest genetic force was never invasion. Not conquest, not empire, not even survival through conflict. It was distance. Distance that separated the island from the churn of the continent. Distance reinforced by water, weather, and geography. Distance that made arrival possible, but never easy, never constant, never large enough to endlessly overwrite what already lived there. Surrounded entirely by sea, Ireland was buffered on all sides. Storm systems guarded its coasts. Unpredictable waters discouraged casual passage. Travel demanded intention, resources, and risk. This alone altered history. While mainland Europe lay open like a crossroads, with armies marching, traders circulating, populations blending, Ireland remained slightly out of step, close enough to be touched, far enough to resist saturation. Empires passed nearby. Some reached in. Few stayed long enough or arrived in numbers sufficient to replace the underlying population. This meant that Ireland experienced fewer sustained waves of population replacement than much of Europe. Not none, but fewer. And fewer is everything when measured over millennia. Isolation does not invent traits. It does not create uniqueness out of nothing. It does not magically generate difference. Isolation preserves. It acts like still air around a flame, preventing gusts from extinguishing or reshaping it. Whatever burns there continues to burn in roughly the same form. Across Europe, the blood type distributions blended. They shifted with every migration. They diluted as new populations arrived, intermarried, and layered fresh genetic material over what came before. Patterns smoothed out. Extremes softened. Rare traits were absorbed into averages. Ireland resisted that smoothing. Here, older patterns lingered. They did not dominate because they were advantageous. They dominated because nothing came in forcefully enough to displace them. The island functioned like a vault, not sealed with iron locks, not guarded by intention, but protected by inconvenience, danger, and distance. The door was never fully closed, but it was rarely opened wide. Visitors came, some settled, some left marks on language, culture, and politics. But genetically, the underlying structure remained remarkably continuous. What survived here was not necessarily stronger, not more evolved, not better adapted to the modern world. It was simply uninterrupted. Time flowed differently inside the vault. Generations passed, but the genetic foundation shifted slowly. Traits were passed down, repeated, reinforced by limited variation rather than diluted by abundance. This continuity created a kind of biological memory. The body remembered what the land had first held. The blood remembered who had arrived earliest. The cells carried echoes of a time before Europe became a thoroughfare. Isolation did not protect Ireland from hardship. It did not prevent famine, war, or suffering. But it preserved something subtler, a long genetic through line running beneath all historical disruption. Empires could rule without replacing. Cultures could influence without erasing. Languages could shift while blood quietly remained. This is the paradox of Ireland. Externally, history looks turbulent. Waves of invasion, resistance, collapse, and rebirth. Internally, at the level of inheritance, the story is steadier. The vault did not choose what to keep. It kept what was already there by allowing little else to enter in overwhelming quantity. And so, while Europe changed rapidly, Ireland changed slowly. Not frozen, not untouched, but buffered enough that ancient patterns survived into modern bodies. Isolation was not a wall, it was a filter. And through that filter, only a fraction of the world ever passed. Chapter 3. Type O and Ancient Survival. Blood type is not cosmetic. It is not a label. It is not a trivial classification added long after the fact. It is biological behavior. It influences how the body responds when the skin is broken, when bacteria enter the bloodstream, when hunger stretches longer than expected, when disease moves quietly through a community. Blood type governs reactions that happen below awareness. Faster than thought, older than language. Type O blood carries a set of distinctive biological traits. Not dramatic mutations, not superhuman advantages, but subtle differences that matter only when life is hard. A different immune response to certain pathogens, a lower tendency toward excessive clotting, documented resistance patterns against some historical diseases. None of these traits guarantee safety, none prevent death outright, but in early human environments they altered probabilities. And survival is nothing more than probability repeated over time. In the prehistoric and early medieval worlds, life was not balanced on comfort or medicine. It was balanced on resilience. Injury was common. Cuts from stone tools, wounds from farming accidents, bone breaks from labor and terrain. Infections followed quickly, often invisibly. A body that clotted too aggressively risked complications. A body that reacted too slowly risked bleeding out. The balance mattered. Type O blood, with its tendency toward less aggressive clotting, sometimes meant wounds drained more freely, but also meant fewer dangerous blockages, fewer fatal cascades inside the body once infection or trauma took hold. Again, not heroism, not immunity, just fewer catastrophic failures. Disease was an ever-present companion. There were no quarantines as we know them, no antibiotics, no understanding of microbes. Illness moved through villages unchecked, testing immune systems relentlessly. Some bodies reacted in ways that escalated damage. Others responded more evenly, containing rather than overreacting. Type O did not repel disease. It did not make people invincible. But in certain historical disease environments, it showed patterns of resistance that translated into marginally higher survival. Marginally. And marginal differences are everything when repeated across generations. Famine, too, played its role. Periods of scarcity were not rare interruptions. They were cycles. Failed harvests, harsh winters, livestock loss, soil exhaustion. Bodies that managed stress responses slightly better, that tolerated deprivation with fewer fatal spirals, were more likely to endure until conditions improved. Again, not forever, just long enough. Type O blood did not guarantee life. It did not promise longevity. It did not spare families from grief. It simply failed less often. And survival is not built on exception. It is built on endurance, on systems that break later rather than sooner, on bodies that hold together just long enough for the next season, the next birth, the next generation. In a world where most people lived close to the edge, small biological tendencies accumulated meaning. Those who survived did not do so because they were strongest. They survived because their bodies made fewer irreversible mistakes under pressure. Over centuries, those marginal survivals became demographic weight. More children reaching adulthood, more bloodlines continuing, more repetition of the same underlying traits. In a sealed or semi-sealed population, this repetition compounds. Type O did not spread because it was dominant by conquest. It spread because it endured by accumulation. Quietly, uncelebrated, unnoticed by the people carrying it. The ancestors did not know blood types. They did not track immunity. They did not understand survival curves. They only knew who lived, who died, and who was still standing when the crisis passed. Biology did the counting for them, and over time the numbers leaned in a consistent direction. Not because type O was exceptional, but because it was reliable. And history at its deepest level is written by what fails last. Chapter 4. The Atlantic Memory Line. Ireland is not alone in this pattern. It never was. When the map widens, when the lens pulls back from a single island, a quiet alignment begins to appear along the far western edge of Europe. High concentrations of type O blood cluster not at the continent's center, not along its great inland corridors, but along its Atlantic rim. Western Ireland, the Western Highlands of Scotland, parts of coastal Wales, and further south the Basque region. Isolated, linguistically distinct, and genetically persistent. These places share more than geography. They share position, they share timing, they share restraint from the main currents of history. They sit where the land ends and the ocean begins, where expansion slows, where movement becomes difficult, selective, and infrequent. These regions represent some of Europe's oldest genetic layers. Not the first humans to enter the continent, but among the earliest to remain without being fully overwritten. They were settled early, and then, crucially, they were bypassed. As later populations surged across Europe, from east to west, from south to north, they followed roads of least resistance. River valleys, plains, trade routes, fertile basins, they built where travel flowed. The Atlantic edge was different. Mountains rose abruptly, weather hardened the coastlines. Soils were thinner, distances longer, returns uncertain. These were not ideal lands for empire. Not ideal for mass settlement. Not ideal for repeated waves of replacement. So the people already there remained. Not untouched, but intact. They absorbed influences without dissolving. They adapted without vanishing. They endured without expanding outward to the same degree as inland populations. The blood remembers where the roads did not go. This is not poetry, it is pattern. Genetic continuity follows absence of traffic. Where armies did not march repeatedly, where traders did not constantly settle, where administrative centers did not anchor power, older biological signatures survived. The Basque region is a stark example. Surrounded by Indo-European languages, yet speaking one that predates them all. Culturally distinct, genetically distinctive, marked by unusually high levels of type O blood. Not because of superiority, not because of purity, but because of continuity. The same story echoes northward. In western Scotland, islands and highlands limited movement. In Wales, terrain and marginality slowed saturation. In Ireland, the sea completed the barrier. Different cultures, different histories, the same underlying logic. Civilizations rise where travel flows. Power concentrates where movement is easy, where goods circulate, where people arrive, depart, and replace one another. Biological mixing accelerates where roads converge. Ancient blood survives where it does not, at the margins, at the edges. In places deemed difficult, unprofitable, or resistant to control. These regions became repositories not of progress, but of memory. Not cultural nostalgia, biological persistence. What looks like isolation on a political map appears as preservation in a genetic one. The Atlantic fringe did not freeze in time. It changed, it suffered, it adapted, but it did so without constant replacement. And so beneath language shifts, beneath religious change, beneath conquest and retreat, the blood carried forward older signals. Signals laid down when Europe was still forming its human shape. The Atlantic memory line is not romantic. It is not mythic destiny. It is geography shaping inheritance. Where the land narrowed and the sea widened, history slowed. And where history slowed, biology kept its earlier handwriting intact. Not loud, not dominant across the world, just persistent enough to still be read thousands of years later. Chapter 5. Stripping away the romance. This is not a tale of purity. It is not a story of superiority. It is not evidence of a chosen people, a hidden hierarchy, or a biological destiny written in blood. Those interpretations are human additions, retroactive myths layered onto neutral facts. Blood types do not determine intelligence. They do not shape creativity. They do not define courage, compassion, or restraint. They do not encode morality. They do not grant spiritual authority or historical entitlement. They do not choose. They respond. They are outcomes, not intentions. A blood type tells one story only, where survival once leaned, slightly, quietly, under very specific conditions. Ireland's high frequency of type O blood is not a badge of honor. It is not proof of resilience as virtue. It is not a sign of exceptional people somehow set apart from the rest of humanity. It is a fossil, a biological imprint left behind by geography, by timing, by isolation, and by chance events that compounded over generations. Fossils do not praise the creatures they preserve. They record that they existed, and that they endured long enough to leave a trace. The sea rose, land bridges vanished, movement slowed, populations stabilized. What remained was not selected for greatness but carried forward by continuity. Chance decided who arrived first. Geography decided who stayed. Time decided what repeated. That is all. There was no test of worth, no judgment, no narrative arc. The bodies that survived did not know why they survived. They did not attribute meaning to their blood. They simply continued. Mammon. And in continuing, they multiplied what they carried. Later generations inherited the result without inheriting the context, and humans, uncomfortable with randomness, tried to turn inheritance into identity. But biology resists romance. It does not care for symbolism. It does not reward intention. It does not preserve what is beautiful, ethical, or admirable. It preserves what remains uninterrupted. Time does not reward meaning, it rewards continuity. Traits persist not because they deserve to, but because nothing replaced them. This is why high type O frequency says more about roads and coastlines than about people. More about weather patterns than about character. More about the absence of traffic than about any presence of virtue. The danger begins when fossils are mistaken for crowns, when patterns are moralized, when statistics are turned into stories of worth, when chance is reframed as destiny. Ireland's blood tells a quiet truth, one that strips away nationalism, mysticism, and pride. It reminds us that much of who we are is not chosen, not earned, and not symbolic. It is inherited from circumstances we did not design and could not control. And that knowledge, properly understood, does not diminish a people. It humbles them. Because if continuity, not meaning, is what time preserves, then identity is not a monument. It is a residue. Something left behind when everything else is past. And the most honest response to that reality is not reverence, but clarity. Long after empires collapse, long after borders blur, long after stories fracture into legend, the body keeps its records. In Ireland, type O blood whispers that the past is not distant. It is circulating, breathing, passing quietly from parent to child without ever asking permission. You are not only who you remember being, you are also what survived to make you possible. If this story stirred something silent in you, stay with the quiet. Like the video, subscribe to Moonlight Whisper, and leave a comment below. What do you feel your blood might still be carrying? Until next time, walk gently through your own inheritance. It has been waiting longer than you know.